Judge mocks black elderly man in court. Shocked when he called his daughter, and everything changed. The heavy doors of Jefferson County Courthouse creaked open, and the murmurs inside the room swelled into a low hum of judgment. Elijah Brooks stepped forward, his worn boots pressing against the polished floor, each step deliberate, unshaken. The scent of old books and varnished wood mixed with the cold sterility of the law, a place where verdicts were less about truth and more about power. The whispers began immediately, a tide of quiet disdain rising from the spectators. Some barely concealed their scoffs, others muttered under their breath. "Another drifter," someone murmured. "What's the point of this trial? Just another bum trespassing where he doesn't belong." Elijah heard them, but he did not react. He had learned long ago that dignity was not something given, it was something held on to, no matter how many hands tried to pry it away. At the front of the room, behind the elevated bench, Judge Logan Barrett barely lifted his gaze from the file in front of him. The man was a fixture of this courtroom, known for his harsh sentencing, his indifference disguised as justice. To him, the law was a hammer, and men like Elijah were just another nail to be driven into the ground. "Next case," Barrett said, his voice sharp, clipped, a sound that had sent hundreds to prison, stripped people of hope, and left no room for sympathy. The assistant district attorney, a woman in a stiff navy suit, stood with a practiced efficiency. Her voice was steady, clinical. "Case number 47,629, the state versus Elijah Brooks, charged with criminal trespassing on private property, Clearwater Estates. This marks the defendant's second offense within 6 months." A low ripple of murmurs moved through the gallery. Second offense. That meant this wasn't just a mistake. That meant this was deliberate, a pattern, a problem to be fixed. Barrett exhaled, rubbing his temple as if this case was nothing but a waste of his precious time. Finally, he looked up, his cold blue eyes settling on Elijah like a weight. "Let me get this straight," Barrett said, leaning back slightly. "You were caught trespassing. Again." Elijah stood tall, his voice calm. "I was sitting by the lake." A beat of silence. Then Barrett let out a short, dry laugh. "The lake," he repeated, as if the very idea was absurd. His smirk widened. "You mean the one that belongs to people who actually paid for that property?" Scattered chuckles rippled through the courtroom. Not loud, but enough. Enough to remind Elijah that here, he was not seen as a man, but as a mistake. Still, he did not react. He did not lower his gaze. Barrett tapped his gavel lightly against the bench, a gesture more of impatience than of maintaining order. "Men like you," he said, shaking his head, "always think nostalgia is a form of ownership. You believe that because a place once meant something to you, it still belongs to you. But that's not how the world works." Elijah remained still, his breath steady. Barrett's eyes flicked down to the file in front of him. 6 months ago, it was Westbrook Country Club, he mused. Now Clearwater Estates. Tell me, Mr. Brooks, what exactly gives you the right to ignore property laws, to walk onto someone else's land as if it were your own? Elijah inhaled, slow and controlled. When he spoke, his voice was the same, measured, even. "I never said it was mine, Your Honor." For a brief second, something flickered across Barrett's face, a hesitation, a moment of unreadable thought. But then, just as quickly, his expression hardened once more. "That," he said sharply, "is not how property rights work." The room felt tighter, the air heavier. Every person watching understood how this would end. Barrett leaned forward, fingers laced together. "You've been here before, haven't you?" he said, flipping through the file, his voice carrying mock amusement. "Seems like you have a habit of showing up in places where you don't belong." The finality in his tone settled like a stone in the room, the weight of inevitability. "I have to say," Barrett continued, his smirk widening, "I admire the consistency. But you see, the law doesn't operate on sentimental value, Mr. Brooks. It doesn't care where you used to fish as a child or where you once walked freely." He sighed, feigning disappointment. "And yet, men like you seem to think that just because life hasn't been kind, the rules don't apply." The words hit the air like a slap, but Elijah did not flinch. He had heard these words before, from teachers who told him to sit at the back, from bosses who dismissed him before they knew his name, from strangers who clutched their belongings when he walked past, from police officers who pulled him over just for existing in the wrong place. He had heard it so many times that it was no longer surprising. Barrett sighed, lifting the gavel slightly. Men like you don't learn from fines, he said, shaking his head. They don't learn from community service. He let out a soft, knowing chuckle. They need real consequences. The words settled over the room like a death sentence. Barrett did not hesitate. I hereby sentence you, Elijah Brooks, to 30 days in county jail. The gavel slammed down. The gavel struck down with a force that seemed to shake the very foundation of the courtroom. The sharp crack echoed against the high ceilings, a final and absolute declaration. 30 days in county jail, a sentence that did not fit the crime, a punishment that was not about law but about power. A decision that had been made long before Elijah Brooks ever stepped foot inside that courtroom. For a moment there was nothing. No murmurs, no whispers, no shuffling of papers. Even the court stenographer, whose fingers had been clicking away at a furious pace just moments ago, hesitated for a fraction of a second before continuing, as if she too had not expected that verdict. The assistant district attorney, who had delivered the charges with mechanical precision, blinked. Her professional mask did not slip, but there was the barest flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She had recommended a fine, maybe community service at most. A man like Elijah Brooks, an old, frail, non-violent man, did not belong in a jail cell, but she did not argue. She did not object, because no one objected, not the court clerks, not the bailiff, not the handful of spectators who had come to watch justice unfold, but had instead witnessed something else entirely. A slow, suffocating realization crept into the air. This wasn't about the law. This was about making a point, and Elijah Brooks understood that better than anyone. He stood there unmoving, as if the weight of that sentence was nothing more than another burden placed on his back, a back that had carried far heavier things. His hands remained at his sides, his posture unwavering, his gaze steady. He did not beg. He did not flinch. He did nothing. And somehow, that nothingness was the most powerful thing in the room. Judge Logan Barrett leaned back slightly in his chair, watching Elijah with the casual detachment of a man who had done this too many times to count. There was no gloating, no satisfaction, just an overwhelming certainty that his word was final. That this was how the system worked. Elijah had seen this before. Different faces, different courtrooms, but always the same script. The judge sitting high above, wielding power like a weapon, the prosecutor delivering charges without emotion, as if reading off a grocery list. The audience, some indifferent, some entertained, but never invested. And the defendant, always the defendant, standing alone, absorbing the weight of a decision that had already been made. He had been here before, he had been sentenced before, and he would be sentenced again. Because for men like him, justice was never blind. It had eyes. It had a voice. It had a gavel that only ever came down in one direction. The silence stretched on, thick and unnatural. Even the bailiff hesitated, glancing at Judge Barrett as if waiting for some unspoken confirmation before stepping forward. Elijah finally exhaled, a slow, measured breath. Not a sigh of defeat, just a breath, a reminder that he was still here, that they had not broken him. Barrett tilted his head slightly, watching him like one might watch a particularly stubborn insect refusing to be crushed. There was something about Elijah's silence that unsettled him. He had expected outrage. He had expected pleading, resistance, anger, but instead he got nothing, and nothing was dangerous, because nothing meant Elijah had expected this. Nothing meant he had already accepted the injustice of it all. And a man who expects injustice does not fear it. The bailiff took another step forward, this time more deliberately. The moment shattered. A few people in the gallery stirred. A chair creaked. The stenographer resumed her furious typing. The courtroom began to move forward as if the last few moments of suffocating stillness had never happened. But Elijah was still standing there, still waiting, and still unbroken. The bailiff stepped forward, reaching for Elijah's arm, but before he could make contact, Elijah spoke. "Before I'm taken," his voice was steady, calm in a way that did not belong in a place like this. "May I make a phone call?" A ripple of surprise passed through the room. It was small, barely perceptible, but it was there. Not in what he had said, but in how he had said it. It was not a request laced with desperation. It was not the voice of a man reaching for a final thread of hope. It was a statement, a formality. Barrett exhaled sharply, shaking his head, then let out a short, mocking chuckle. "A phone call," he repeated, his voice thick with derision. "To who exactly? A lawyer? A friend? Someone who thinks they can change the inevitable?" Elijah did not blink. Barrett smirked, leaning forward slightly. "Or maybe you're hoping someone will pay your bail? Someone out there who still thinks you're worth something?" More scattered chuckles echoed from the gallery, whispers of amusement from those who had already dismissed him. But Elijah, he was unshaken. He simply extended his hand, palm up, a silent request. The bailiff hesitated. There was something unnatural about the moment, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. He had seen men ask for phone calls before, some crying, some angry, some making frantic last attempts to reach a world that had already let them go. But Elijah was not reaching for anything. He was calling something to him. With a sigh, the bailiff pulled a cell phone from his pocket and placed it in Elijah's waiting hand. The metal and glass reflected the dim overhead lighting, but Elijah barely looked at it. He already knew the number. He dialed, one ring, two, a click. And then, in a voice as steady as stone, he spoke 4 words. "It's time. Bring them." Then just as smoothly, he handed the phone back. The room stilled. A few heads turned toward one another in confusion, brows furrowed. Who was them? What was it time for? But Elijah gave no explanation. He simply clasped his hands in front of him, waiting. Judge Barrett's smirk faltered just slightly. He narrowed his eyes, tapping his fingers against the bench. He did not like this. He did not like not knowing. "Elijah," Barrett said slowly, testing the waters, "what exactly do you think that little phone call is going to change?" Elijah did not answer, and somehow that was worse than anything he could have said, because his silence was not submission, it was patience. And patience meant he knew something that Barrett did not. A quiet murmur rippled through the courtroom, barely more than a whisper, but growing, spreading. Even the prosecutor, who had delivered the charges with impersonal detachment, shifted uneasily, because they all felt it now. Something was coming. The bailiff swallowed hard, his grip tightening on Elijah's arm, but he did not pull him away. Not yet, because now they were all waiting, and waiting meant doubt. Barrett's fingers curled against the bench. The gavel was there, inches from his reach, a symbol of control. But for the first time today, it did not feel like he was the one holding power. Not anymore. The courtroom doors burst open, slamming against the walls with a force that sent a shockwave through the room. Heads snapped toward the entrance, eyes widening as heels clicked against the marble floor, crisp and deliberate. She did not pause. She did not ask permission. She walked with purpose, cutting through the heavy air like a blade, her movements controlled, her presence undeniable. The kind of woman who did not knock. She entered. Her black suit was immaculate, tailored to perfection, exuding the kind of power that could not be ignored. A sleek leather briefcase dangled from one hand, a weapon as lethal as any gavel in this courtroom. But it was her eyes, sharp, unwavering, unforgiving, that sent an uncomfortable shift through the gallery. Maya Brooks. Whispers erupted like wildfire. They knew that name, a powerhouse in the legal world, a woman who turned cases into victories, a corporate giant, feared in boardrooms, respected in courtrooms. She was the kind of attorney who did not waste her time on lost causes. So why was she here? The judge's fingers tightened around his gavel. "This is a courtroom, Ms. Brooks," Barrett said, his voice clipped. "You can't just walk in here." She ignored him. Instead, she strode directly to the defense table and stopped. A hush fell over the room as she placed a hand on Elijah Brooks' shoulder. A silent statement. A claim. A warning. Barrett's mouth pressed into a thin line. "I assume you're here for a reason." Maya finally turned to face him. Her expression was unreadable, but her presence filled every inch of the room. "You've made a mistake, Your Honor," she said smoothly, her voice carrying a quiet authority that silenced every whisper. Barrett scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "And you are?" Maya tilted her head slightly as if amused. "Maya Brooks." The name landed like a bomb. Gasps rippled through the gallery. The prosecutor stiffened. The bailiff hesitated, because in that instant, everyone understood. She wasn't just here as a lawyer. She was here as Elijah Brooks's daughter. The heavy courtroom doors hadn't even stopped swinging when three men followed behind Maya Brooks, moving with purpose, precision, and power. They were dressed in dark, impeccably tailored suits, each carrying a sleek leather briefcase embossed with a name that sent an immediate ripple of tension through the room: Warren and Grant, LLP. It was a name that needed no introduction. The most feared law firm in the country. The kind that didn't waste time on petty cases. The kind that didn't walk into courtrooms unless they intended to win. The prosecutor visibly tensed, fingers tightening around her pen. The court stenographer hesitated before resuming her furious typing. Even the bailiff, trained to remain impassive, shifted slightly, his grip tightening on his belt. Judge Logan Barrett's jaw clenched. His fingers drummed once against the bench before stopping abruptly. His posture stiffened, his authority instinctively rising in defense. Maya did not slow. She strode straight to the bench, her heels clicking against the polished floor, not with urgency but with certainty. The three attorneys flanked her, standing like sentinels. She did not ask to speak. She did not acknowledge the gas rippling through the gallery. She simply reached into her bag, pulled out a thick, bound file, and placed it directly in front of Judge Barrett. A single motion, controlled, deliberate, undeniable. For a moment, the room held its breath. Then she spoke. "Before you make another decision, you need to read this." The words landed with a thud heavier than the file itself. Barrett's nostrils flared. He glanced down at the folder but did not reach for it. Instead, his cold blue eyes snapped back up to Maya, his patience razor thin. "You think you can just walk into my courtroom and—" "This isn't your courtroom, Judge." Her voice was calm, but sharp, not raised, not aggressive. But it cut through the air like a blade. The murmurs grew louder now, like distant thunder rolling closer. Barrett's lips pressed into a thin line. "Ms. Brooks," he said slowly, his voice a dangerous edge of controlled irritation. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but this hearing is over. I have already ruled no." It was a single word, but it carried the weight of an avalanche. Barrett's fingers twitched. Maya stepped closer. "I suggest," she said coolly, precisely, "you read that file before you continue embarrassing yourself." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Barrett's face reddened. His authority had never been challenged like this. Not in his own courtroom, not in front of a full audience, not with this level of undeniable force. For a moment, it looked like he might refuse. Then his eyes flickered, just briefly, toward the logo embossed in gold on the folder. Warren and Grant, LLP. His hand tightened into a fist. Judge Logan Barrett's grip tightened on the thick stack of documents, his knuckles whitening as he held them in front of him like a shield. His breathing had slowed, but his heart pounded, a slow, heavy beat against his ribs. His lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line as he forced his eyes back to the first page, needing to see it again, needing to confirm that what he had just read was, in fact, real. But the words hadn't changed. Elijah Brooks. Not a drifter, not some nameless, forgotten old man loitering on private property. A man of brilliance, a man of historical significance, a man whose very name was woven into the foundations of modern aerospace engineering. Judge Barrett's pulse jumped as he turned the page, his hands stiff, methodical, almost robotic in movement. He wasn't in control anymore. His body was just reacting. Another page, another piece of history. Elijah Brooks had been instrumental in designing some of the most advanced guidance systems used by NASA. His patents, not one, not two, but several dozen, had shaped modern spacecraft navigation, propulsion, and aerodynamics. His name had been cited in government research, in military technology, in billion-dollar aerospace contracts. Barrett could feel the pressure building behind his eyes. He had spent his entire career looking down at men like Elijah Brooks, treating them as burdens, as cases to be closed, as nothing more than numbers in a system designed to forget them. But now the man standing before him was not some vagrant clinging to old memories. He was a man who had put astronauts in space. The weight of his own ignorance pressed down on him. The judge flicked his gaze up, just for a second, to see Elijah. The old man hadn't moved. He stood exactly as he had before, calm, steady, patient. He had known. He had known exactly what was coming. The courtroom felt suffocating. Barrett turned another page. This time it was a funding record. His breath caught. Not only was Elijah Brooks a NASA engineer, a patented inventor, a man whose innovations had changed the aerospace industry, he was also a major donor. Not just to scholarships, not just to research institutions, not just to STEM programs across the country, but to the judicial system itself. Judge Barrett's own courthouse had received funding from Elijah Brooks. The walls surrounding him, the very foundation of his own courtroom, had been paid for in part by the same man he had just sentenced without a second thought. The irony was so sharp it almost drew blood. Barrett's jaw tightened painfully. His fingers gripped the file so hard the edges bent. How had he not known? He had ruled over thousands of cases, had seen countless names cross his desk. He had never thought to look deeper, never thought that the man standing before him today could have been anything more than what he assumed. His own arrogance had led him here. He should stop reading. He should slam the file shut, regain control, reassert his authority. But he couldn't. He turned another page, and there it was, the final blow. The property deed, official, legally binding, stamped with the state seal. Elijah Brooks was not a trespasser. He was not some old man illegally wandering into a gated community. He was the rightful owner of the land, the same land he had been arrested for trespassing on. Judge Barrett's blood ran cold. His hands felt clammy, his vision tunneled for a moment. He had accused this man, mocked him, humiliated him, sentenced him to jail, on the assumption that he was nothing. And yet Elijah Brooks was the one who owned the land. Not just a piece of it, all of it. His land, his lake, the same land that the court had declared off limits to him. The silence in the room was unbearable. He could feel dozens of eyes watching him, could sense the unease rolling through the courtroom. Even though no one else could see the documents, they could see what they were doing to him. His control was slipping. Barrett swallowed, trying to gather himself, but it was pointless. He turned back to the deed, the dates, the records, the signatures. They all confirmed the same thing. Elijah Brooks had owned Clearwater Estates long before the people who lived there now. Long before they had built their luxury homes, their private roads, their walls designed to keep men like him out. The very place they had accused him of trespassing on had once belonged to him, and now it still did. Judge Barrett felt something he had never felt before. Not anger, not frustration, something closer to fear. Because this was not just an oversight. This was a mistake so catastrophic it would cost him everything. His hands shook slightly as he flipped back to the first page, scanning over the words again, as if hoping they had changed. They hadn't. Nothing had, except for his entire perception of the man standing before him. For the first time in his entire career, Judge Logan Barrett found himself at a loss. There were no objections to overrule, no loopholes to exploit, no way to undo what had just been revealed. There was only the truth, and the truth had just dismantled him. The courtroom was suffocating in silence. It wasn't the silence of respect or order. It was the kind that settled into the bones, that made the air feel too thick to breathe, that made every second feel like a lifetime. Judge Logan Barrett sat frozen behind the bench, his once commanding presence reduced to something small, something fragile. His grip on the thick stack of documents hadn't loosened. If anything, his fingers had curled tighter around the papers, as if physically holding on to them would keep the truth from slipping through his grasp. But it was too late. The truth had already shattered the courtroom. His breath came in short, uneven bursts, his chest rising and falling in an irregular rhythm as he forced himself to reread the words he had already seen. His mind fought against them, resisted them, rejected them, but the ink on the page did not change. Elijah Brooks was not a trespasser. He was not a drifter, not a squatter, not some forgotten relic of the past. He was a NASA engineer, a visionary, a man whose inventions had changed the world. And worst of all, he was a man who had personally contributed to the very system that had just condemned him. Barrett's pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out every sound but his own ragged breathing. His carefully curated facade, the mask of control he had worn for decades, was slipping with every passing second. He was exposed. He could feel the weight of dozens of eyes fixed on him, watching, waiting, dissecting every twitch of his fingers, every subtle shift in his expression. They had never seen him like this. No one had. The great Judge Logan Barrett, the unshakable force of the Jefferson County Courthouse, was unraveling right before them. His skin had gone ashen, his once flushed cheeks now drained of color. A bead of sweat trickled down the side of his temple, but he did not move to wipe it away. Because he couldn't. He couldn't move. He couldn't speak. He couldn't even breathe properly. The prosecutor, who had spent the entire trial delivering charges against Elijah Brooks with practiced indifference, was now shifting uncomfortably in her seat, her brows knitted in uncertainty. Even the bailiff, a man who had spent years maintaining order in the courtroom, looked hesitant, his posture stiff, his hands hovering near his belt as if expecting something to happen. But nothing did. No one spoke. No one dared to break the silence that had swallowed the room whole. Barrett tried to force his lips to move, tried to summon the commanding tone that had once sent defendants cowering and attorneys scrambling for objections. But when he finally spoke, his voice betrayed him. "This," he started, his throat dry, hoarse, the word barely escaping his lips. "This can't be real. This must be a mistake." But it wasn't. He knew it wasn't. He flipped the pages frantically now, his hands shaking slightly as he scanned the documents again. As if somewhere hidden in these pages, there would be an error, a misprint, something to discredit this entire revelation. But the dates matched, the names matched, the signatures matched. It was all there, all legally documented, all indisputable. His mind flashed back to every cruel word he had spoken to Elijah Brooks just moments ago. "You were caught trespassing. Again." You think nostalgia is ownership. That's not how the world works. The memory of his own sarcastic smirk, his mocking tone, his absolute certainty that Elijah Brooks was just another failure looking for sympathy. It sickened him. Barrett's stomach twisted. His own arrogance had led him here. His own refusal to look beyond his biases had put him in this position, and now there was nowhere to hide. A slight twitch flickered at the corner of his left eye. He clenched his jaw, grinding his teeth so hard his temples ached. This was a nightmare, a waking, inescapable nightmare. He had sentenced a NASA engineer to 30 days in jail for sitting on his own land. The realization slammed into him like a fist to the gut, and he couldn't deny it. The evidence was in his hands. The silence grew heavier. The room felt smaller. The weight of dozens of unblinking eyes pressed against him like a force of gravity he could not escape. A cold sweat ran down his spine. Judge Barrett had spent years commanding respect, controlling the fates of those who stood before him. But today, it was his fate hanging in the balance. His hands, once steady and firm, shook against the polished wood of the bench. He couldn't look up. He couldn't meet the eyes of the man he had just condemned, because he knew. Everyone in this courtroom knew. The great Judge Barrett had made the biggest mistake of his career, and at the center of it all, Elijah Brooks stood, unshaken. His voice, calm, steady, and unwavering, still echoed through the room, lingering in the air like a challenge that could not be dismissed. "Now tell me, Your Honor, do you still think I was trespassing?" It was not a plea. It was not a demand. It was a sentence. Judge Logan Barrett had spent his career passing judgment, rendering decisions that shaped and shattered lives. But now, for the first time in his life, he was the one standing trial, and he knew it. His breath came shallow, unsteady, a sharp contrast to the man standing before him. His hand twitched, his fingers instinctively moving toward his gavel, as if he could regain control with a single strike of wood against wood. But even he knew This was beyond the reach of his authority, because this wasn't just about Elijah Brooks anymore. This was about everything. The courtroom roared to life. Murmurs swelled into full conversations. Reporters scrambled for their phones, their cameras, their laptops. Their fingers flew across keyboards, capturing every second of the moment. Knowing this was history unfolding before them, the headlines were already writing themselves. Disgraced Judge Barrett exposed in racial bias case. NASA engineer sentenced unjustly, legal system in question. Shocking courtroom turn, judge speechless after learning truth. The audience leaned in, whispering, murmuring, gasping, exchanging glances filled with a mixture of awe and disbelief. The energy in the room had changed. No longer a place of quiet, obedient respect for the system, but something far more dangerous. This was resistance. This was the moment the people in the courtroom saw the truth laid bare and refused to look away. The bailiff shifted uneasily, his grip on his belt tightening. He was used to maintaining order, used to enforcing the judge's word without question. But now even he seemed to hesitate, waiting for some kind of command that wasn't coming. Because Judge Barrett was frozen, his mouth opened slightly as if to respond, as if to find some legal justification, some technicality that would make this all go away. But there was nothing, no argument, no defense, no excuse. Because the truth was written in ink, sealed in official records, and now spoken aloud for all to hear. He had sentenced the owner of the land for trespassing on his own property. He had dismissed a NASA engineer as a common vagrant. He had laughed, mocked, and humiliated a man who had built the very systems that sent astronauts beyond the stars. And now everyone knew. His authority, his power, his reputation, his very name was crumbling before his eyes. Elijah Brooks, however, remained as steady as a mountain. He did not gloat. He did not sneer. He simply watched, because he had nothing left to prove. This was the moment that men like Judge Barrett feared most. Not an outburst of rage, not a plea for mercy, but the undeniable truth standing right in front of them. Judge Barrett's hands curled into tight, trembling fists as the noise around him grew louder, unstoppable, undeniable. A rising wave of consequences rushing toward him, and for the first time in his career, he had nowhere to run. The fight for justice is just beginning. More shocking twists are ahead. Don't miss a moment. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay with us. Thank you for standing for truth and justice. Where are you watching from? Let us know. The weight of judgment had shifted. For years, Judge Logan Barrett had been the one casting verdicts, delivering sentences, deciding fates with a flick of his wrist and the slam of a gavel. But now, as he sat behind the bench, fingers clenched around the damning documents in front of him, he was the one being judged, and there was no mercy in the eyes that stared back at him. The lawyers in the room, men and women who had once stood before him, who had once argued cases under his unyielding rule, now looked at him with something else entirely: contempt. It was in the way they tilted their heads slightly, their expressions unreadable but their thoughts undeniable. It was in the slight curling of lips, the narrowed eyes, the shared glances between them. Judge Barrett had been untouchable. Not anymore. His authority had been absolute, unquestioned. But now they saw him for what he was, and they were disgusted. A slow shift moved through the room, a silent reckoning as attorneys, prosecutors, and legal professionals watched a man who had once ruled over them crumble under the very system he had so mercilessly upheld. They had no sympathy for him. He hadn't had any for them. Barrett swallowed, his throat dry. He could feel it happening. The quiet exodus, the subtle, deliberate retreat. The judges who had been seated in the back, the ones who had watched the events unfold with growing unease, were leaving. Not all at once, not in a rush. That would draw too much attention. But one by one, they gathered their things, adjusted their robes, and slipped out through the side doors. A silent message. This was a disaster, a scandal, and they wanted no part of it. Barrett's fingers curled into a fist. His skin was clammy, his once steady breathing now shallow. He had never been ignored like this before. He had never been left behind. But now even the people who had once stood beside him were walking away, because his name was already burning. and no one wanted to be caught in the fire. And in that moment, as the weight of his own arrogance crushed him, Judge Logan Barrett realized this was not a trial about Elijah Brooks. It was a trial about himself, and Maya Brooks knew it. She stood before him, her presence commanding, immovable, her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that burned. Then, with deadly precision, she spoke. "We will not sue to tarnish the reputation of a judge." A single beat of silence. Then, the strike. "Because that would require you to have had one in the first place." The words cut through the courtroom like a blade. A gasp rippled through the audience. Sharp, involuntary, stunned. Barrett flinched, not visibly, not dramatically, but Maya saw it. She saw the way his jaw clenched, the way his fingers tightened slightly against the desk, as if grasping for control that had long since slipped away. For the first time in his career, he had no response. Nothing to counter with, nothing to argue. Because the worst part of it all, the most unbearable part, was that she was right. This was not a courtroom debate. This was not about evidence or legal technicalities. This was a verdict, and he had sentenced himself. The arrogance that had once made him untouchable had now left him exposed. The certainty with which he had ruled over others had turned against him, leaving him stripped, hollow. The courtroom felt like it was closing in on him. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room bearing down on him. The reporters, their fingers moving rapidly, capturing every second of his humiliation. The attorneys, their gazes filled with nothing but disdain. The other judges, the ones who had already slipped away, abandoning him. And then there was Elijah Brooks, still standing, still watching, and worst of all, still waiting. Because Elijah had never needed to raise his voice, never needed to demand justice. He had simply stood there and let the truth do its work. And now Barrett had to live with it. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. Media attention exploded the moment the courtroom incident spilled into the public sphere, transforming what had once been a hushed legal proceeding into a full-scale national scandal. In newspapers, on television, and across social media, headlines screamed in unison: "Racist judge exposed in explosive scandal," and "NASA engineer jailed for sitting by his own lake, the injustice of the century." Every outlet, from venerable broadsheets to online news aggregators, seized upon the story, each headline more incendiary than the last. These sensational declarations did more than report the facts. They ignited outrage and stoked the flames of a public already weary of a system marred by prejudice and impunity. It wasn't long before live broadcasts showed images of Judge Logan Barrett, his once imperious face now ashen, his hands trembling as he clutched the documents that had so irrevocably unmasked his bias. The camera zoomed in on his pallid expression, capturing every moment of his humiliation as he sat, isolated on his bench, his authority in tatters. Reporters crowded the courthouse steps, their microphones thrust forward and their voices overlapping in a cacophony of urgent questions. "How could a judge with such a pristine record fall so low?" one anchor demanded. "Is our legal system so deeply entrenched in discrimination that even the highest court is not immune?" Another correspondent, speaking directly to the camera, declared, "The evidence is undeniable. A NASA engineer, a man whose innovations once propelled our nation into space, has been wrongfully condemned, while this judge, whose rulings have long been steeped in bias, now faces the full force of public scrutiny." The rapid spread of these reports ensured that within hours, every major news network was devoting primetime segments to the scandal. Editorials and opinion pieces blasted the legal establishment, questioning not only Barrett's personal integrity, but the broader system that allowed his unchecked arrogance to thrive. Within the corridors of power, a palpable shift occurred. The legal establishment, once unwavering in its deference to Barrett's authority, now found itself forced into damage control. Colleagues who had once lauded his decisive rulings began distancing themselves from him. In whispered conversations in the hushed hallways of the courthouse, Senior lawyers exchanged knowing glances, their eyes betraying a mix of shock and disdain. "How could we have let this happen?" one remarked quietly to another, his voice laden with regret and disbelief. The very institutions that had once protected Barrett's unchecked power now turned their backs on him, fearful that his disgrace might taint their own reputations. Judges who had sat alongside him during countless proceedings were seen gathering their belongings and slipping quietly out of the courtroom. Their departures a silent admission that association with him was now a liability too great to bear. As the storm of public outrage intensified, government officials and legal watchdogs were forced to take action. The Judicial Conduct Review Board, under immense pressure from both lawmakers and a vociferous public, announced an immediate investigation into Barrett's conduct. Rumors swirled that the inquiry would extend beyond this single case, reaching back into years of his controversial rulings. Lawmakers, emboldened by the fervor of a public demanding accountability, called for swift reforms aimed at dismantling the systemic biases that had allowed such abuses of power to fester unchecked. In legislative halls, fiery debates ensued as politicians, representing a broad spectrum of opinions, argued the merits of overhauling the entire judicial oversight process. Proposals ranged from the establishment of independent ethics panels to more radical measures designed to strip judges of any semblance of immunity from public accountability. In every corner of the country, citizens, empowered by the immediacy of the scandal, demanded change, their voices merging into a chorus of protest that could not be ignored. Amid this maelstrom of accusations, investigations, and public indignation, one figure's exit from the courtroom resonated with a quiet, unassailable dignity. Elijah Brooks, the man at the heart of the scandal, did not leave amid a clamor of despair or a crescendo of anger. Instead, he rose from his seat with a serene determination that spoke volumes without a single raised voice or tearful plea. There was no fanfare, no triumphant shout proclaiming his innocence. His departure was marked only by the quiet, measured steps of a man who had long internalized the injustice thrust upon him and had, in his own unspoken way, achieved a victory over a corrupt system. As he walked out of the courtroom, his back straight and his gaze unwavering, the cameras captured an image that would soon become emblematic of the entire debacle. A silent figure of quiet strength and unyielding truth, his every step resonating as a powerful repudiation of the injustice he had endured. In stark contrast to the chaotic fervor directed at Judge Barrett, Elijah Brooks's exit was a study in stoic grace. His demeanor was not one of a defeated man resigned to a fate of subjugation. Rather, it was that of a man who had faced down the worst that the legal system could inflict and emerge, if not unscathed, then certainly unbowed. As he stepped into the light of a now uncertain future, his measured stride and calm composure served as a tacit challenge to those who had wielded their power without accountability. His silence spoke louder than any protest, his dignity more potent than any outcry. In that moment, Elijah transformed from a mere defendant into a symbol, a living testament to the resilience of truth in the face of overwhelming prejudice and corruption. The impact of the scandal rippled far beyond the courthouse walls. Within hours, social media platforms exploded with hashtags and trending topics that captured the essence of the debacle. Hashtags such as Barrett Exposed, Justice for Elijah, and Injustice of the Century trended worldwide, galvanizing a movement of activists, legal reformers, and ordinary citizens who demanded not only justice for Elijah Brooks, but sweeping changes to an entire system that had long tolerated discrimination and elitism. Viral videos, shared by millions, showed snippets of the courtroom's most damning moments. Barrett's face as it turned ashen, the silent, resolute gaze of Elijah, and the palpable tension that had electrified every inch of that chamber. News anchors and pundits debated furiously on primetime shows, their analyses dissecting every aspect of the case, from Barrett's seemingly casual disregard for due process to the systemic failures that had allowed such a miscarriage of justice to occur. Editorial pages, once filled with routine commentary on legal matters, were now dominated by impassioned calls for accountability and reform. Columnists argued that Barrett's downfall was not merely the consequence of one man's hubris, but a symptom of a deeper, more pervasive rot within the judicial system, a system that had, for far too long, permitted the powerful to trample the rights of the vulnerable with impunity. Even as the media's relentless assault continued unabated, the corridors of power within the legal community underwent a profound transformation. Judges who had once been Barrett's staunch allies began to speak out, their voices emerging from the shadows to denounce the prejudices and unchecked authority that had defined his tenure. Law firms, some of which had long benefited from the opaque networks of influence that Barrett represented, now found themselves under intense scrutiny. Senior partners issued statements expressing regret over their past associations and pledging support for a comprehensive review of judicial practices. Legal scholars, too, weighed in on the crisis, citing Barrett's case as a stark example of how personal bias could corrupt the very foundations of justice. A reminder that no individual, regardless of his position, was beyond reproach. At the heart of this upheaval was a profound reckoning with the values that the legal system claimed to uphold. The nation, having long been divided over issues of race, power, and equality, now witnessed a tangible moment of accountability, a moment when the truth, no matter how inconvenient or uncomfortable, could no longer be suppressed by the trappings of authority. The widespread public outcry and the swift response of the investigative bodies signaled a new era, one in which the mechanisms of justice would be held to a higher standard, and those who abused their power would face consequences that were both swift and severe. Throughout the entire maelstrom of controversy, one image remained seared into the collective consciousness: a silent, resolute figure walking away from the ruins of a corrupt system. Elijah Brooks, in his quiet triumph, had become more than just a defendant. He had become a beacon of hope for all those who had ever been wronged by a system that was supposed to protect them. His dignified exit, captured by countless cameras and immortalized in headlines and social media posts, spoke of a truth that could never be denied: that in the struggle against injustice, even the most powerful can fall, and that the spirit of a man who refuses to be broken can illuminate the darkest corners of oppression. As the days passed, the full ramifications of the scandal began to unfold. Investigations into Judge Barrett's rulings expanded rapidly, uncovering patterns of discrimination that shocked even the most jaded legal observers. Legislative hearings were convened, bringing together lawmakers, legal experts, and civil rights advocates to chart a course for reform. Public opinion, once indifferent to the slow grind of bureaucratic injustice, had now been ignited into a fervor that demanded radical change. Communities across the country organized rallies and town hall meetings, their chants echoing with the refrain that justice must be equal, that the scales of law must be balanced, and that no one, no matter how high their station, should be allowed to trample the rights of the many in favor of the privileges of the few. In the midst of this upheaval, Judge Barrett found himself increasingly isolated. His once mighty persona, built on years of unchallenged power, had been eroded by the relentless tide of evidence and public indignation. Colleagues formerly silent in his presence now turned away. Friends who once offered quiet assurances no longer dared to meet his gaze. The legal community, now ablaze with calls for accountability, had little patience left for a man whose downfall was as spectacular as it was inevitable. His future on the bench, once assured by decades of service and the deference of those who followed him, now hung by a thread that was being pulled tighter by the unyielding forces of justice and reform. In contrast, as the media's relentless barrage continued to intensify, Elijah Brooks' quiet departure from the courtroom resonated as an enduring symbol of victory. Without a word, without a gesture of triumph, he had left the scene of his own injustice with a calm that defied the storm raging behind him. His exit was not an act of surrender, but a silent, powerful statement that truth and dignity could not be vanquished by corruption and bias. With each step he took away from that chamber, he carried with him not only the burden of his own past sufferings, but also the hope of a future where justice was not a commodity to be manipulated by the powerful. His resolute silence, immortalized in the flashing images on television screens and the viral posts on social media, sent a message that echoed far beyond the confines of that courtroom. That even in a system marred by injustice, The spirit of an individual can rise above the forces that seek to crush it. Thus, as the relentless tide of media coverage, public outcry, and institutional reform swirled around Judge Barrett, his once unassailable authority crumbled like a house of cards in a storm. The scandal that had erupted was not merely a momentary lapse in judicial conduct. It was a transformative event that exposed the deep-seated inequities of a system long dominated by unchecked power and prejudice. In that tumultuous aftermath, while the legal establishment scrambled to restore its credibility and reassert its authority, Elijah Brooks's quiet, dignified walk away from the courtroom became a rallying cry for justice, a symbol of the triumph of truth over tyranny, and a reminder that no one, not even a judge steeped in authority, is immune from the consequences of their actions. The gavel fell with a resounding finality that echoed through the now silent courtroom. Yet it was not the sound of justice being served. It was the sound of a system collapsing under the weight of its own corruption. In that moment, as the dust of scandal settled and the faces of those present betrayed a mix of disbelief and resolve, one message rang out louder than any verdict. Justice is not always on the side of the powerful, but the truth always wins. This was not an abstract concept debated in legal treatises or lofty speeches. It was a lived reality, as tangible and brutal as the cold steel of a prison cell, and as undeniable as the evidence that had just shattered decades of entrenched prejudice. In the days that followed, the fallout from the courtroom debacle rippled across the nation. News outlets, both traditional and digital, splashed sensational headlines across their front pages and scrolling tickers. "Racist judge exposed. The fall of a tyrant," screamed one headline, while another boldly declared, "NASA engineers' truth triumphs over injustice." Every channel, from national broadcasts to local radio stations, was abuzz with discussions about how a judge, once considered untouchable by virtue of his position and power, had been unmasked as nothing more than a relic of a bygone era of bias. In every report, pundits, legal experts, and everyday citizens converged on the same conclusion. The scales of justice, though long tilted in favor of the powerful, had been rebalanced by the unstoppable force of truth. Throughout the media frenzy, countless articles recounted the harrowing details of that fateful day, the shattering silence in the courtroom, the damning documents that exposed years of prejudice, and the moment when Elijah Brooks, the wronged NASA engineer, whose innovations had once propelled humanity to the stars, had risen with quiet dignity to challenge the oppressive authority of Judge Barrett. Reporters recounted how, as the damning evidence unfolded before a stunned audience, Barrett's own arrogance turned against him. His trembling hands and ashen face were captured by cameras and broadcast live, a testament to the moment when his carefully constructed facade crumbled in the face of irrefutable truth. The narrative was clear. A man who had long wielded his power to crush those he deemed inferior was now being held accountable, and his downfall was a victory for every individual who had ever been marginalized by an unjust system. Within the hallowed halls of the judiciary, the shock was equally palpable. Colleagues and peers, once deferential to Barrett's unyielding authority, now looked upon him with open disdain. Meetings that were once marked by hushed respect turned into quiet murmurs of disapproval as legal luminaries and reform advocates debated the implications of his disgrace. Some judges, fearing that their own reputations might become tainted by association, began to distance themselves from the scandal. They left courtrooms quietly, slipping away from the corridors of power as if the mere presence of Barrett's shadow could undermine their own hard-won credibility. In a system that had long been insulated from accountability, this retreat was nothing short of seismic, a clear indication that the old order was crumbling, unable to withstand the relentless surge of public demand for reform and transparency. As the legal establishment reeled, lawmakers seized upon the moment to call for sweeping changes. Parliamentary committees convened emergency sessions to address systemic biases, and proposals for new oversight measures were introduced with fervor. Bills aimed at enhancing judicial accountability, ensuring greater transparency in court proceedings, and protecting the rights of the marginalized were fast-tracked. In heated debates across legislative chambers, advocates argued passionately that the truth, however inconvenient, must prevail over the entrenched power structures that had long manipulated the scales of justice. This is not merely an isolated incident, declared one influential senator during a televised hearing. It is the culmination of years of injustice, a damning indictment of a system that has consistently sided with the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. The call for change reverberated not only through the corridors of government, but also across communities and online platforms, where citizens demanded that those who held power be held to account. Amid this maelstrom of reform and public scrutiny, Elijah Brooks emerged as an emblem of hope and resilience. Unlike many who had been swept away by the tempest of injustice, Elijah's quiet dignity had never wavered. He did not march out of the courthouse with triumphant shouts or tearful protests. Instead, he left with a calm, measured stride that spoke volumes of a man who had weathered the storm of injustice and emerged unbroken. His silence in the face of overwhelming adversity was not an admission of defeat, but a profound statement of strength. In his eyes, there was no room for anger or bitterness, only the serene certainty of truth that in the end always prevails. His departure from the courtroom was captured by journalists and quickly turned into a symbol of righteous defiance, a living reminder that, while those in power might manipulate the law to serve their interests, the immutable nature of truth would eventually cast its light on the darkest corners of injustice. The media's relentless assault on Judge Barrett, however, did not stop with sensational headlines and scathing editorials. It ushered in a period of intense introspection and debate among legal scholars, civil rights activists, and the general public. Editorial pages in major newspapers became battlegrounds for arguments over the integrity of the judicial system. Some argued that Barrett's downfall was a rare moment of long overdue accountability, a beacon of hope that would usher in an era of reform and fairness. Others, though fewer in number, decried the turn of events as an anomaly, a momentary lapse in an otherwise respectable institution. Yet as the investigation unfolded and more damning evidence came to light, even the most skeptical voices were forced to acknowledge that Barrett's case was symptomatic of a broader, systemic failure. The once opaque corridors of judicial power were now under the unforgiving glare of public scrutiny, and nothing could hide from the all-seeing eyes of a society determined to see justice done. In every televised debate, in every social media post, and in every fervent discussion at dinner tables across the country, one truth became inescapably clear. While the law might often bend to the will of the powerful, the truth was a force that could not be contained or corrupted. It was a constant, unyielding beacon that illuminated the dark recesses of prejudice and dishonesty. The scandal that had erupted in that courtroom was not just about the wrongful conviction of a brilliant engineer. It was a damning indictment of a system that had, for far too long, allowed personal biases and unchecked authority to dictate the fates of ordinary people. The narrative was simple yet profound. No matter how entrenched the power structures might be, or how meticulously they shielded themselves with layers of bureaucratic obfuscation, the truth always finds a way to rise above the mire. It is the one currency that never devalues, the one standard by which all others are measured, and in the end, it is the only force capable of delivering genuine justice. The events that transpired in that courtroom and the subsequent media frenzy served as a powerful catalyst for change. Across the nation, legal institutions were forced to confront uncomfortable truths about their own operations. Training programs on implicit bias were overhauled, ethical standards were re-examined, and new protocols were introduced to ensure that judges and other officials could no longer hide behind the facade of unassailable authority. Public pressure, amplified by the unrelenting power of modern communication, had initiated a profound shift in the very foundation of justice. The reverberations of this transformation were felt not only in the halls of government, but also in communities that had long suffered under the weight of injustice. For many, the scandal was a turning point, a moment when the collective voice of the people broke through the silence and forced a reckoning with a system that had allowed the powerful to dominate without accountability. As the investigation into Judge Barrett's conduct progressed and the calls for reform grew louder, the legacy of that day began to crystallize into something far greater than a mere scandal. It became a symbol of hope for all those who had ever been marginalized by a system that was supposed to protect them, a testament to the enduring power of truth and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming adversity. The message was clear and unequivocal. Justice is not always on the side of the powerful, but the truth always wins. This message, etched into the collective memory of a nation, served as a rallying cry for reform, an inspiration for activists and citizens alike, and a reminder that even in the darkest moments of injustice, there exists a light that no amount of power or corruption can ever extinguish. In the end, as the tumult of scandal receded and the wounds of injustice began to heal, the final message emerged not as the triumph of any one individual, but as the undeniable victory of truth over tyranny. It was a message that resonated deeply within the hearts of all who had witnessed the fall of an unjust system and the quiet, unyielding rise of a man who had stood tall in the face of overwhelming prejudice. It was a testament to the enduring belief that while the scales of justice may be manipulated by those in power, the truth remains an immutable force that, no matter how long it is suppressed, will eventually break free and restore balance. And so, as the sun rose on a new day marked by hope and transformation, the legacy of that courtroom battle stood as a powerful reminder. In the eternal struggle between power and truth, it is truth alone that holds the ultimate victory. What do you think? Is justice truly blind, or does it simply choose who to see? Elijah Brooks never raised his voice. He never begged, never pleaded. He didn't need to, because the truth spoke for itself. This case was never about one man. It was about a system that failed him, a system that was designed to serve justice, but, too often, serves power instead. And today that system was exposed for what it truly is. But how many others have suffered in silence? How many stories have gone unheard? How many verdicts have been passed in courtrooms just like this one, where the weight of prejudice outweighs the evidence? This isn't just one case. This is a reckoning. If you believe this story needs to be heard, if you believe in exposing injustice, in demanding accountability, in making sure this never happens again, then make your voice count. Like, share, follow. Let the world see. Let them know. Because justice isn't real until it belongs to everyone. Judge plays Truth or Lie with Black Teen. Seconds later, he's left speechless by a legal genius. The gavel slammed against the wooden desk with a sharp crack, silencing the murmurs that rippled through the packed courtroom. In the defendant's seat stood Jaden Carter, a black boy, his hands gripping the wooden rail before him. His face was composed, but his sharp eyes burned with defiance. At the judge's bench, Harold Whitmore. He was infamous for his ruthless verdicts, his unyielding belief in the system, and his ability to control his courtroom with an iron fist. And now he was looking down at Jaden, as if he were nothing more than a reckless child who had wandered into a world he could never hope to understand. He smiled. "Mr. Carter," the judge said, his voice calm, almost pleasant. "Before we proceed, I thought we might play a little game." Jaden's brow furrowed, but he kept his expression neutral. He knew better than to trust men like Whitmore. The judge leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. "It's called Truth or Lie." His gaze flickered across the room before landing back on Jaden. "I'll make a statement. You tell me whether it's true or false. A simple test of your knowledge. Would you like to participate?" A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom. Some saw it as a joke, others as a condescending test of a child's intellect. Jaden inhaled deeply. He wasn't here to play games, but refusing might be worse than playing along. He gave a curt nod. "Go ahead." Whitmore smiled victorious. He tapped his gavel lightly against the desk, then spoke in a deliberate, measured tone. "A person is innocent until proven guilty, truth or lie." Silence. Jaden's fingers curled around the edge of the defense table. The words hung in the air like a blade suspended above his head, daring him to move. Finally, his voice rang out, sharp and clear. "Lie!" Gasps erupted from the gallery. Even the stenographer's fingers hesitated for a fraction of a second before continuing their relentless typing. Jaden didn't need to turn around to know that shock had rippled through the room like an electric current. Whitmore's smirk flickered, his amusement dimming slightly. He hadn't expected that answer. "Oh?" the judge mused, tilting his head. That's an interesting response, Mr. Carter. Care to explain? Jaden stood taller. He had prepared for this. Because in reality, he said, people like me black boys are treated as guilty before they ever get the chance to prove their innocence. His voice didn't waver. We don't get the benefit of the doubt. We don't get presumed innocent. We get handcuffed first and questioned later if we're lucky. A murmur spread across the audience, rising in volume. Some nodded, others scoffed. The tension tightened like a noose. Whitmore's smile vanished. The courtroom had shifted and he felt it. He wasn't in control anymore. He tapped his gavel once. Order. The murmuring died down, but the energy in the room remained volatile. The judge's posture stiffened. He wasn't going to let a 14-year-old dictate the tone of his courtroom. Let's try again, Whitmore said, his voice clipped. A judge must be completely fair and unbiased. Truth or lie? Jaden's lips curled into a knowing smile. Lie. This time, Whitmore's fingers twitched around the gavel. Explain. Jaden exhaled slowly, making sure each word hit with the weight it deserved. Because judges are human. Humans have biases, whether they admit it or not. His eyes didn't waver as they locked onto Whitmore's. You, for example, have already decided that I'm just a kid who doesn't know what he's talking about. A ripple of shocked murmurs filled the air. The prosecution shifted uncomfortably. Even the court officers seemed unsure of how to react. Whitmore's face darkened. The amusement was gone. Now there was only steel. You seem to think quite highly of your own insight, Mr. Carter. I don't think highly of anything, Jaden countered. I just think honestly. For the first time, the judge seemed truly irritated. His jaw tightened, his hands pressing against the bench. The power dynamic was shifting, and he didn't like it. Jaden wasn't just defending himself. He was exposing the cracks in a system that had never been designed for people like him. And the room knew it. Whitmore exhaled through his nose, slow and measured, as if reining in the urge to lash out. This is a courtroom, not a debate hall, he said, and I will not have you turning it into a spectacle. Jaden's expression didn't change. I'm not the one making it a spectacle, Your Honor. The courtroom exploded. Some in the gallery applauded under their breath. Others whispered in hushed tones, their excitement barely contained. The prosecution's lead attorney shot up from his seat. Your Honor, I object. Whitmore slammed the gavel down with more force than necessary. BAM. Enough. The room fell into a heavy silence. The judge's gaze bore into Jaden like a dagger. His face was unreadable, but his eyes burned with a cold fury. He wasn't used to losing control, especially not to a black kid who was supposed to be standing there, afraid, waiting for his fate. Jaden knew what Whitmore was thinking. This boy is dangerous. He doesn't know his place. He needs to be put in check. The judge's voice came slow, deliberate. Since you seem so confident in your understanding of the law, let's put it to the test. He leaned forward, the fluorescent lights casting sharp shadows across his face. Do you wish to continue this trial representing yourself? Jaden hesitated for the first time. The question had been a trap, carefully placed to back him into a corner. If he said no, Whitmore would twist his previous statements against him, painting him as nothing more than a loudmouth who didn't truly understand the system. If he said yes, he'd be expected to defend himself against a seasoned prosecutor who had spent years sending people like him to prison. The room was waiting. Jaden met the judge's gaze head-on. I do. The courtroom collectively inhaled. Whitmore's expression flickered with something close to satisfaction, but underneath there was something else. Concern. Because in all his years on the bench, in all his years presiding over cases where black boys sat in that defendant's chair, waiting for their turn to be chewed up and spit out by the system, none of them had ever dared to fight back like this. The gavel slammed once more. Then may the law decide. And just like that, the game had changed. Jaden wasn't just fighting for his innocence anymore. He was fighting to rip the mask off an entire system. Jaden Carter had always believed in the law. He had spent hours in the library, poring over legal textbooks, fascinated by the mechanics of justice, by the idea that facts mattered more than assumptions, that truth outweighed bias. But in that moment, face pressed against the cold hood of a police car, wrists locked in steel cuffs biting into his skin, he realized that belief had been nothing more than a lie. The flashing red and blue lights painted the cracked pavement beneath him, distorting reality with every flicker. The weight of a knee dug into his back, pressing him down as if he were a caged animal. Around him, bystanders had gathered, some pulling out their phones, others whispering, their voices blending into a suffocating hum. The sound of sirens drowned out the world, but Jaden could still hear the officer's voice, sharp and final. You matched the description. That was all it took. No questions, no hesitation, no regard for the fact that he had been in the city library, sitting at a wooden table beneath dim fluorescent lights, his fingers flipping through the worn pages of a constitutional law book when they stormed in. He had barely looked up before hands grabbed him, rough, forceful, like he was property, not a person. Get up! What's going on? Jaden had asked, trying to keep his voice steady, to keep his mind calm, but his heartbeat was already hammering in his ears. The officer didn't answer. Another one grabbed his arm, yanking him up so fast the chair he had been sitting in clattered to the ground. The librarian gasped, stepping forward, but stopped short when a third officer shot her a warning look. What's the charge? Jaden tried again, his voice sharper this time, demanding an explanation. You're coming with us. I didn't do anything, Jaden protested, his feet dragging as they hauled him toward the exit. Tell it to the judge, one of them muttered, shoving him forward. I didn't do anything, Jaden protested, his feet dragging as they hauled him toward the exit. Tell it to the judge, one of them muttered, shoving him forward. It didn't matter that he hadn't resisted. It didn't matter that there had been no warrant, no probable cause. All that mattered was that he looked like the kind of boy who could have done something wrong. By the time he was forced into the back of the patrol car, his breathing was ragged, his chest heaving. The inside smelled like sweat and old leather, the cage separating him from the officers up front, a glaring reminder that he had already been judged. Outside, through the streaked windows, people were still watching, some with pity, others with silent indifference. Nobody stopped them. Nobody asked questions. They didn't have to. The system had already decided his fate. At the station, the questions were rapid fire, but none of them were the ones that should have been asked. Where were you at the time of the crime? Number, do you have an alibi? Number, instead, they treated him as if the case had already been solved, as if his guilt had been predetermined the moment they laid eyes on him. We have you on video, one officer said, leaning over the table. The interrogation room was cold, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, casting sharp shadows across the walls. Jaden sat rigid, jaw clenched. No, you don't. The officer smirked. You want to see it? He gestured to the screen on the far end of the room. The grainy surveillance footage played, showing a blurry figure in a hoodie walking past the scene of the robbery. The figure's face was completely obscured. The footage was dark, the angles bad. That's your evidence? Jaden asked, unable to keep the disbelief out of his voice. You fit the description, the officer said smoothly, as if that alone was proof. Jaden's blood turned to ice. You fit the description, the oldest excuse in the book. A black kid in a hoodie, Jaden said, his voice low, simmering. That's your whole case. The officer didn't flinch. You were in the area. Jaden's nails dug into his palms. I was in a library. The officer leaned in. Prove it. Jaden sucked in a slow, measured breath. I checked out a book. There's a timestamp. A record. The officer exchanged glances with his partner before shrugging. Maybe the timestamps are wrong. Maybe you checked it out and left right after. Jaden let out a short, bitter laugh. So I teleported across the city and robbed a store at the same time? The officer's expression darkened. They didn't care about proof. They just needed someone to blame, and he was the easiest target. Hours passed, no lawyer, no phone call, just a dimly lit cell and the faint scent of bleach and desperation clinging to the air. Jaden sat on the hard bench, staring at the concrete wall, replaying every second of the last few hours in his head. This isn't happening. Except it was. Outside, life went on. People went home to their families. The city bustled. And somewhere the real suspect was probably enjoying their freedom because the police had found their scapegoat. Footsteps echoed down the corridor. A metal door creaked open. Carter! an officer barked. Jaden looked up, his body stiff from sitting still for so long. "You're being processed for trial," the officer said, unlocking the cell door. Jaden's heart pounded. Trial? Already? What about the alibi? The book checkout records? The fact that the video was garbage? His thoughts spiraled, but his face remained stoic, because deep down he knew. This was never about justice. This was about convenience, about power, about control. They had thrown him into the system like so many before him, and now it was up to him to fight his way out. He exhaled slowly, steeling himself. He might have walked into this police station as a victim, but he wasn't going to leave as one. The story of Jaden Carter's arrest spread like wildfire. At first, it was just another headline buried beneath the bigger scandals of the day: teen arrested for robbery, a story barely worth a mention. But then, the details began to surface. A black boy, no weapon, no stolen goods, no evidence, just a blurry surveillance video and a so-called matching description. And suddenly the city had something to talk about. The news cycles churned, each outlet spinning its own version of the narrative. Some painted Jaden as a troubled youth, a cautionary tale of urban crime. Others questioned the police's hasty actions, subtly hinting at the racial profiling at play. But for every voice that called the arrest unjust, there were a dozen more who stood by the system. If the police arrested him, there must be a reason. Why would they target him if he was truly innocent? He shouldn't have been in the area to begin with. Talk shows debated endlessly. Legal analysts dissected the case with the cold precision of a coroner examining a lifeless body. Social media became a war zone. Justice for Jaden trended alongside trust the system. Strangers who had never met him, never heard his voice, argued over his fate as if he were nothing more than a pawn in a larger game. And yet, through all the noise, one thing remained chillingly clear: Jaden Carter was already guilty in the court of public opinion. Not because of evidence, not because of facts, but because the system had said so. As the trial resumed, the weight of the prosecution's case rested on the so-called evidence they had gathered. Now it was time for them to prove Jaden's guilt, but he was ready to dismantle every false claim they threw at him. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. The air felt heavy, charged with an energy that crackled just beneath the surface. Every seat was filled, reporters hunched over their notepads, cameras clicking in rapid succession, capturing every moment, every expression, every flicker of doubt that crossed a face. But Jaden Carter sat still, his back straight, his hands clasped together on the table before him. He refused to show fear, even as he faced a system designed to break him. At the prosecutor's table, Robert Calloway stood, his suit crisp, his expression sharp. He was a seasoned attorney, a man who had built his career on winning cases like this, cases where the accused were young, black, and already presumed guilty before the trial even began. His confidence was evident in the way he moved, the way he adjusted his tie before speaking, the way he glanced at the jury as if they were already in his pocket. "Ladies and gentlemen," Calloway began, his voice smooth, calculated, "the prosecution will now present undeniable evidence that places the defendant, Jaden Carter, at the scene of the crime." Jaden didn't move. He had expected this. Calloway turned toward the large screen positioned to the side of the courtroom. With a nod, he signaled to the technician, and the screen flickered to life. The footage was grainy, black and white, taken from a low-angle security camera outside a corner store. The timestamp in the corner read 8:42 p.m., 2 minutes before the robbery had reportedly occurred. A figure in a dark hoodie walked past the store. The resolution was so poor that the person's face was completely obscured, just a shadowy outline under the hood. The footage played for a few more seconds before cutting off abruptly. Calloway turned back to the jury, his voice unwavering. "There you have it. The defendant, at the scene, moments before the crime." He let the words settle in the air. "You saw it for yourselves. You saw him." Jaden clenched his jaw. This was their smoking gun? A blurry figure in a hoodie? He leaned forward, his voice steady. "You don't see my face in that video." Calloway turned, his smirk unwavering. "The hoodie matches what you were wearing that night." Jaden exhaled slowly. He had prepared for this. He forced his hands to relax, his expression calm. Let me ask you something, Mr. Calloway. He tilted his head slightly. How many black boys wear hoodies? The question hung in the air. Calloway hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. That's irrelevant. No, Jaden said, his voice firm. It's very relevant. Because what you're saying is that a black kid walking down the street in a hoodie is enough to convict him of a crime. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Jaden could feel the shift in energy, the weight of doubt creeping into the minds of those watching. Judge Harold Whitmore tapped his gavel once, his face unreadable. Let's keep the arguments focused, Mr. Carter. Jaden ignored him, locking eyes with Calloway. Being near a crime doesn't mean you committed it. You don't have my face on that video. You don't have any proof that I went inside that store. You don't have anything except a blurry figure in a hoodie. He leaned forward. So tell me, Mr. Calloway, where's your actual evidence? Calloway's jaw tightened. We have a witness. Jaden raised an eyebrow. A witness? Calloway nodded and turned to the jury. That's right. Someone saw the defendant near the store that night. Someone who can confirm it was him. Jaden folded his arms. Who? Calloway hesitated. For their safety, the witness has chosen to remain anonymous. Jaden let out a short, humorless laugh. Of course, an anonymous witness, who magically saw my face even though your video doesn't show it. He shook his head. You don't have a witness, do you? Calloway's nostrils flared slightly. The prosecution does not disclose. Jaden cut him off. So let me get this straight. Your whole case is built on a blurry video and a ghost witness? He turned to the jury. That's what they call justice? The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Even some of the jurors were shifting uncomfortably. Judge Whitmore slammed his gavel down hard this time. BAM. Enough! His voice was firm, cutting through the tension like a blade. The trial will proceed in an orderly fashion. Jaden's chest rose and fell slowly. He knew what was happening. Whitmore was trying to maintain control, to steer the case back in favor of the prosecution. But Jaden wasn't going to let them railroad him without a fight. He turned back to Calloway. Show the video again. Calloway frowned. What? Jaden's voice didn't waver. Play the video again. The judge glanced at Calloway, then nodded. The prosecutor gritted his teeth and signaled to the technician. The screen flickered once more, the grainy footage rolling again. The shadowy figure moved past the store, head down, hands in pockets. Jaden watched closely, every detail burning into his mind. Then just as the figure stepped under a dim streetlight, something caught his attention. There, Jaden pointed. Pause it. The technician froze the frame. Jaden pushed himself up, stepping closer. Zoom in on the shoes. The technician hesitated, then did as instructed. The blurry image sharpened slightly, revealing a pair of sneakers, white with a thick black stripe on the side. Jaden turned back to Calloway. I was wearing black Converse that night. The courtroom stilled. Calloway's face paled slightly. He turned toward the screen, his lips parting slightly, as if he had just realized his mistake. Jaden didn't let up. So either I changed my shoes in the middle of the street, or... He let the words hang. That's not me in the video. Silence. A crack had formed in the prosecution's case. Judge Whitmore shifted in his seat, his fingers tightening around the gavel. He cleared his throat. The prosecution will continue. Calloway straightened, quickly recovering. The video is still strong, circumstantial evidence, and combined with the witness statement, Jaden pounced. The imaginary witness? Calloway clenched his jaw. You don't get to dictate how the prosecution presents its case. Jaden leaned back, crossing his arms. I don't have to. You're doing a great job falling apart all on your own. Laughter rippled through the audience. Even some of the jurors looked amused. Whitmore slammed his gavel down again. That's enough. He turned to Calloway. Move on. The prosecutor swallowed hard, flipping through his notes. For the first time since the trial had begun, he looked shaken. The courtroom was a storm waiting to break. The murmurs rippled like an undercurrent, a tide swelling just beneath the surface, held back only by the thin veil of decorum. Then came the announcement that should have changed everything. A uniformed officer pushed through the heavy doors, his voice cutting through the tense silence like a blade. Your Honor, We've apprehended the real suspect. For a moment, time stopped. Gasps echoed through the gallery, a wave of confusion and disbelief rolling across the room. Journalists fumbled with their pens. Cameras clicked in rapid succession. Jaden's breath caught in his throat. His fingers curled against the edge of the defense table, his mind racing to process what he had just heard. The real suspect? Then that meant he turned toward Judge Harold Whitmore, waiting, expecting to hear the words that would finally set him free. This should have been it, the moment where the nightmare ended, where justice finally did what it was meant to do. But something was wrong. Judge Whitmore didn't react the way he should have. He didn't nod. He didn't order Jaden's immediate release. Instead, he exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the gavel. His expression remained unreadable, but there was something else there now: annoyance. Jaden felt his stomach twist. Why wasn't he ending the trial? His lawyer, a tired-looking man who had barely spoken throughout the case, straightened in his chair. "Your Honor," he said, clearing his throat, "given this new information, I assume my client is free to go?" The room held its breath. Whitmore's gaze swept across the courtroom, taking in the shifting energy, the flicker of uncertainty, even among the jurors. Then, in a voice that was calm, calculated, and ice-cold, he spoke. "No." Silence. A heavy, suffocating silence. Jaden's blood ran cold. His lawyer frowned. "Excuse me?" Whitmore adjusted his glasses, his gaze falling to Jaden with that same detached authority he had worn since the trial began. While the arrest of another suspect is noted, it does not erase the fact that the defendant was present near the scene of the crime. Jaden's body tensed. He stared at the judge, disbelief crashing over him in waves. "What?" His voice came out sharper than he intended, but he didn't care. "You're still putting me on trial?" Whitmore's tone remained unshaken. "You were in the area at the time of the crime." Jaden couldn't believe what he was hearing. Being near a crime isn't a crime. His voice rose, anger bleeding through his words. "That's not how this works." His lawyer, looking equally stunned, tried again. "Your Honor, my client has an alibi. The only evidence against him was circumstantial, and now we know there is an actual perpetrator." Whitmore didn't waver. "The trial will continue." The words hit Jaden like a sledgehammer. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, a current of voices swelling into something dangerously close to outrage. Someone in the back stood up. "This is a joke!" another voice shouted. Whitmore's gavel slammed down. "BAM. Order!" But the people didn't quiet as quickly as they had before, because now it was obvious. This wasn't about justice. This was about power, about control, about a system that had decided Jaden's fate long before the trial even started. Jaden's pulse pounded in his ears. His breathing was fast, his thoughts racing. This wasn't just wrong, this was madness. He turned fully to Whitmore now, his voice low but edged with steel. "So what are you saying?" His hands balled into fists. "That just being near a crime scene makes me guilty?" Whitmore's gaze hardened. "I am saying that this court still has reason to believe." Jaden cut him off, fire in his voice now. "If I was white, would we even be having this conversation?" The question ripped through the air like a gunshot. The courtroom froze. Whitmore's jaw tightened, his fingers gripping the gavel like a lifeline. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence spoke for him. Jaden let out a slow breath, his chest rising and falling as he scanned the room. They all saw it now. The jurors, the reporters, even the courtroom guards. They saw the system for what it really was. For the first time since the trial began, Whitmore looked like a man trying to hold something together that was already falling apart. He could feel control slipping through his fingers. Jaden straightened, his voice steady, unwavering. "You have no case," he said, his words a challenge, a declaration. "No evidence, no testimony that holds up. You arrested me because I fit the description. You kept me here because it was convenient." Whitmore's face darkened, his gavel slamming down again. "BAM. Enough." But Jaden didn't stop. "You don't want justice," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "You just want me to lose." Gasps. The murmurs swelled again. Whitmore's mask of control cracked. He looked at Jaden, and for the first time, there was something beneath the cold exterior. Fear, because he knew Jaden wasn't scared anymore. For so long, the judge had been in control. The system had been in control. But now Jaden Carter was winning. Whitmore exhaled slowly, his shoulders stiff. He adjusted his glasses, his expression unreadable. He tapped the gavel once more, his voice eerily even. "This court is adjourned for today. We will reconvene tomorrow." Jaden stared at him, his chest heaving. Tomorrow? They were just delaying the inevitable. But fine, he'd be back. And next time, he wouldn't just be defending himself. He'd be taking the whole system down with him. The courthouse corridors were dimly lit, the fluorescent bulbs flickering overhead, casting sharp shadows on the linoleum floor. Jaden Carter moved carefully, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, trying to make himself as invisible as possible. The break between sessions was supposed to be a moment of reprieve, but his mind was racing too fast to rest. Something was wrong. He could feel it in the way Judge Whitmore had refused to dismiss the case, even after the real suspect had been caught. He could see it in the way the prosecutor, Robert Calloway, had tightened his jaw, his frustration barely concealed beneath his polished courtroom demeanor. Jaden turned a corner and stopped just before the vending machines. His mouth was dry, his throat tight. He wasn't even sure what he was doing where he was going. But then, as if fate had placed him in exactly the right spot at exactly the right time, he heard voices, low, hushed, urgent. Instinct kicked in. He froze, pressing himself against the wall just outside the partially open break room door. He knew eavesdropping was a risk, but something told him this was worth the danger. Inside, two figures stood under the dim glow of a flickering overhead light. Calloway and a uniformed officer. Their backs were to Jaden, their heads bent slightly toward each other. The officer's voice was clipped, impatient. "We need to wrap this up fast." Jaden's breath caught in his throat. Calloway crossed his arms, his tone quieter, but no less sharp. "Can we stretch it out longer?" The officer exhaled, shaking his head. "No need." Orders came from above. A slow chill crawled down Jaden's spine. Orders came from above. His mind spun with possibilities. What orders? From who? Calloway's fingers drummed against his forearm as he stared at the floor, deep in thought. Then finally he spoke. "And Whitmore?" The officer let out a short, humorless chuckle. "Already handling it. He'll make sure it drags long enough for everything to settle. But at the end of the day, you know how this works." Jaden clenched his jaw. "You know how this works." That single sentence was enough to make his blood boil. Because he did know how this worked. He had been watching it unfold since the moment they threw him in handcuffs for a crime he didn't commit. It didn't matter that the truth was out there. It didn't matter that they had caught the real suspect. The system wasn't designed to clear his name. It was designed to break him. A chair scraped against the tile. The conversation was ending. Move. Now Jaden took a step back, his heart pounding. His legs felt heavy, his body screaming at him to run, to disappear before they noticed him. But he forced himself to walk steady, controlled, normal. If they caught him lurking, he was done. A voice stopped him cold. "Carter." Jaden's body went rigid. His pulse hammered in his ears, but he forced himself to keep moving. Maybe he had imagined it. Maybe if he just, "Don't walk away." Jaden turned. Captain Victor Reynolds stood in the hallway watching him. The man was a fortress of authority, his uniform pristine, his gold badge gleaming under the dim courthouse lighting. Everything about him screamed power, control, and something far more dangerous, certainty. He wasn't here to talk. He was here to end something. Reynolds took a slow step forward, his boots clicking sharply against the linoleum. "You've been busy," he said, voice calm, even. Too calm. Jaden's fists clenched at his sides. He didn't respond. Reynolds exhaled through his nose, his sharp gaze never leaving Jaden's face. "I don't like messy situations, Carter. And right now, you're making a mess." He tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "That's not good for you." Jaden swallowed down the fire rising in his chest. He knew what this was. A warning disguised as advice. A noose disguised as a handshake. But he refused to be scared into silence. What's wrong, Captain? Jaden asked, keeping his voice steady. Afraid the truth might slip out? A flicker of amusement crossed Reynolds' face, but it was gone as quickly as it came. He stepped in closer, lowering his voice to something just above a whisper. I'm going to make this simple for you, Reynolds said, his words slow, measured. Walk away. Drop this. Do whatever it takes to make it to the end of this trial without causing any more trouble. His eyes locked onto Jaden's, dark and unblinking. Because if you don't, you're going to find yourself in a situation you won't walk away from. The air felt thinner, like all the oxygen had been sucked out of the hallway. Jaden stared him down, forcing his breath to remain steady. He could feel the heat of rage rising inside him, the suffocating weight of a system that had never meant to let him go free. But fear had no place here. He leaned in slightly, his voice just as quiet, just as sharp. I guess we'll see about that. Reynolds' jaw tightened just barely. His hand twitched like he was itching to reach for something. His badge, his gun, his authority. But then, just as quickly, he relaxed. A slow smirk curled at the edge of his lips. You've got guts, kid, he murmured. Shame that won't save you. He took a step back, adjusting his sleeves. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, his boots clicking down the hall until he disappeared through the double doors. Jaden didn't move. He didn't breathe, because he knew exactly what had just happened. Captain Reynolds hadn't come to threaten him. He had come to deliver a promise. The system had decided they weren't going to let him win. But they had made one fatal mistake. They had underestimated Jaden Carter. The fight for justice is just beginning. More shocking twists are ahead. Don't miss a moment. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay with us. Thank you for standing for truth and justice. Where are you watching from? Let us know. After Reynolds' warning, Jaden knew one thing for certain: he was running out of time. If the system was rigged against him, he needed proof. The night was thick with silence, broken only by the distant hum of streetlights buzzing against the cool air. Jaden Carter sat hunched in the dim glow of an old laptop screen, his fingers tensed over the keyboard. Across from him, Elijah Brooks leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, an eyebrow raised. This is a bad idea, Elijah muttered. Jaden didn't look up. Then why are you still here? Elijah sighed, rubbing his temples. Because you're my best friend, and because I know you won't let this go until we see what's inside. They were in Elijah's basement, an old cluttered space filled with tangled wires and half-dismantled computer parts, his personal hacking den. The air smelled faintly of dust and overheated circuits. Jaden clenched his jaw. He had no choice but to do this. Reynolds had all but promised him that the system wouldn't let him win. If he wanted the truth, he had to take it himself. Elijah cracked his knuckles and leaned forward. All right, he sighed. Let's see how deep this rabbit hole goes. His fingers flew over the keyboard, typing in strings of code, bypassing firewalls with the ease of someone who had done this a dangerous number of times. The screen filled with scrolling data, police files, reports, records hidden behind layers of security. Then bingo. All right, Elijah muttered. We're in. Jaden's pulse thundered in his ears. Search the suspect, he said, his voice low. Elijah typed quickly, then froze, his face twisted in confusion. Jaden leaned closer. What? What's wrong? Elijah tapped the screen, scrolling through the file. This doesn't make sense. There's nothing here. Jaden's stomach tightened. What do you mean nothing? I mean nothing. No ID, no mugshot, no background. Just a name and a single line confirming his arrest. Elijah's voice dropped, tension thick. This guy doesn't exist. Jaden's skin went cold. The police had arrested a ghost, a fabricated suspect to cover their tracks. They created him, Jaden whispered. Elijah nodded slowly, his expression dark. They needed someone to take the fall so they wouldn't have to drop your case. They needed the public to think they got the right guy. He shook his head. But he's just a placeholder. Jaden's hands curled into fists. They never planned on letting him walk free. His breath came slow, measured, controlled, but his mind was racing. If they had faked an entire suspect, then how much more had they tampered with? Elijah, Jaden said, forcing his voice to stay steady, check my file. Elijah hesitated, Jaden, check it. Elijah exhaled sharply, then started typing. The screen flickered, and then Jaden stilled. His file was wrong. It wasn't just a case file anymore. It was a criminal record. Jaden felt his blood go ice cold. They had altered his history, made him look like a repeat offender. What the? Elijah's voice cut off, his eyes wide. He scrolled through the falsified details, his fingers trembling. They changed your record, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. They added prior offenses, vandalism, theft, resisting arrest. He looked up, horrified. Jaden, they're making you look like a career criminal. Jaden's heartbeat pounded against his ribs. They're setting me up, he said quietly. Elijah swallowed hard. They want to make sure that no matter what happens in court, no one believes you. Jaden's fingers dug into the edge of the desk. This wasn't just a case. They were erasing him. They're making sure I don't walk out of this, he muttered. They're rewriting my life so that even if I prove my innocence, I'll still be guilty in the eyes of the system. Elijah's hands hovered over the keyboard. We need to copy this. All of it. Jaden nodded, his jaw tight. Save everything. Elijah started extracting the files, his fingers flying, but his expression was grim. This isn't just corruption, he muttered. This is orchestrated. Someone high up wants you gone. Jaden clenched his fists. Reynolds, Whitmore, Calloway. They were all in on it. Elijah's laptop beeped, signaling the download was complete. He yanked out the flash drive and handed it to Jaden. This is your insurance, he said. Whatever happens next, we have proof. Then Elijah stiffened. Jaden! There was something in his voice, a sharp edge of panic. Jaden followed his gaze to the window. A black SUV was parked across the street. Engine running, lights off. Jaden's breath hitched. Elijah swallowed hard. Tell me that's not for us. Jaden didn't answer. Then the driver's door opened. Elijah, Jaden said, his voice deadly calm. We need to move. Now. Elijah yanked the flash drive from the laptop and shoved it into his pocket. Jaden snapped the laptop shut and grabbed his hoodie, his body already shifting into fight-or-flight mode. They ran. The front door was too risky, the back alley faster. Jaden threw open the basement door, Elijah close behind. Footsteps heavy and fast pounded against pavement outside. Someone was coming for them. They burst into the alley, cold air slamming into their lungs. Behind them, the SUV revved, tires screeching. Jaden grabbed Elijah's sleeve. Left! They sprinted down the narrow alley, jumping over trash bags, dodging dumpsters. The SUV skidded around the corner, blocking the street ahead. Crap! Elijah gasped. Jaden whipped around, dragging Elijah toward a side fence. Climb! They scrambled up, metal rattling under their weight. A car door slammed. Footsteps. Fast. Close. Hands grasped at Jaden's ankle. He kicked out hard, sending his attacker stumbling back. He vaulted over the fence, hitting the ground hard but not stopping. Elijah landed beside him, panting. Dude, we are actually going to die. Jaden ignored him, scanning for an escape route. The SUV whipped around, headlights flooding the alley. Then another set of headlights appeared at the far end, a black sedan. It skidded to a halt, and the driver's door flew open. Vanessa Carter. Get in, she shouted. Jaden and Elijah didn't hesitate. They dove into the back seat, slamming the doors just as Vanessa hit the gas. The SUV screeched after them. Bullets ripped through the night, shattering the back windshield. Jaden ducked low, adrenaline spiking through his veins. Vanessa didn't flinch, her hands steady on the wheel. What the hell did you two do? She demanded. Elijah, still panting, threw up his hands. Oh, you know, just hacked into police files, found out Jaden was being framed, and now some guys with guns want to kill us. So, totally normal night. Jaden shot him a glare. Not helping. Vanessa swerved hard, the car narrowly missing a telephone pole. Behind them, the SUV was still gaining. Jaden's fingers dug into the seat. Vanessa, we need to lose them. She gritted her teeth. Working on it. Ahead, a narrow alley. Vanessa whipped the wheel, sending the car into a sharp turn. The SUV was too big to follow. It screeched to a stop, trapped at the entrance. Vanessa didn't slow down. She gunned it, pushing the car further into the night. Jaden exhaled for the first time in minutes. Elijah groaned, pressing a hand over his racing heart. I am never hanging out with you again. Jaden let out a shaky breath. We're not done yet. He pulled the flash drive from Elijah's pocket, holding it tight in his palm. They had proof now, and they were going to burn the whole damn system down with it. The city pulsed with quiet tension as Vanessa Carter pulled her car into the underground parking garage beneath her office. The tires screeched slightly as she braked hard, the echoes bouncing off the concrete walls. She threw the car into park, exhaling sharply before turning to face Jaden Carter and Elijah Brooks, who sat wide-eyed in the back seat, still catching their breath from the chase. We don't have much time, she said, reaching for her phone. If they were willing to chase you down like that, it means they know you have something. She locked eyes with Jaden, her expression firm. And that means we need to move, now. Jaden nodded, gripping the flash drive so tightly in his palm that he could feel the plastic edges digging into his skin. This small device held everything: proof of corruption, of falsified records, of a system so determined to bury him that they had fabricated an entire suspect just to keep their lies afloat. Elijah swallowed hard. So what's the plan? Do we just walk into a police station and hand it over? Vanessa scoffed. If you're looking to get arrested or worse, sure, but we're not playing by their rules. She turned to Jaden. We need to make this public, loud, unavoidable. Jaden's heart pounded. He had spent days fighting to be heard in a courtroom that was designed to silence him. But the court wasn't the only battlefield. The world needed to see what they had done. Vanessa led them upstairs to her office, a dimly lit space cluttered with case files and stacks of legal documents. It smelled like old paper and stale coffee, a place where truths were usually buried, not unearthed. She powered up her desktop, the screen flickering to life. Plug it in! Jaden stepped forward, his hands shaking only slightly as he inserted the flash drive into the port. The files loaded instantly, a flood of damning evidence spilling onto the screen. Police reports with altered timestamps, falsified records, the fake suspect with no identity, Jaden's own file, doctored to make him look like a criminal. Elijah let out a slow breath. Man, this is huge. Vanessa's lips pressed into a thin line. This isn't just about you, Jaden. This is proof of a system-wide cover-up. She turned to him. If we do this right, it won't just clear your name. It'll take down everyone involved. Jaden clenched his fists. Reynolds, Whitmore, Calloway. They had all played a part in trying to bury him alive. But now he had the shovel. Vanessa cracked her knuckles. All right, first we leak it to the press. We send this to every journalist, every independent investigator who's ever wanted to take down police corruption. Then we hit social media hard. Elijah grinned, already pulling out his phone. Now that's my area of expertise. He started typing furiously, setting up burner accounts, queuing posts, preparing hashtags. We need this to go viral, not just trending unstoppable. Jaden took a deep breath. He had never been the kind of person who wanted attention. Now he had no choice. Vanessa began forwarding files to trusted journalists, her fingers moving fast. We're sending it in waves. First, the police corruption, then the falsified evidence, and last, the fact that they framed a 14-year-old kid to protect their system. Jaden exhaled, his chest tight. And what happens after that? Vanessa's gaze was sharp. We watched them burn. The next few hours passed in a blur. Elijah worked on spreading the files across multiple platforms: Twitter, Instagram, Reddit, even underground forums that specialize in exposing government corruption. Vanessa kept her contacts informed, ensuring that the story couldn't be silenced before it had a chance to explode. Jaden watched it all unfold, his mind spinning. Every click, every post, every shared file was a battle won. Then it happened. The internet caught fire. The first news article broke within an hour. New evidence suggests police framed black teen in high-profile case. Then another. Judge Whitmore under fire after shocking evidence leak. Then the hashtag started. Free Jaden. The system is rigged. Justice for Jaden. His name was everywhere, and with it, the truth. Comments poured in, some in shock, some furious. Some people still refused to believe it, clinging to their faith in the system. But others were ready for war. Jaden stared at the screen, his breath shaky. He had spent so long fighting to be heard. Now his voice was being amplified by thousands. Elijah nudged him. "We did it, man." Jaden swallowed, his hands still trembling. Not yet. Because he knew what came next. They had forced Reynolds and the others into a corner, and cornered animals were the most dangerous. The world had finally seen the truth. For weeks, Jaden Carter had fought to prove his innocence. He had been silenced, ignored, and nearly erased. But now the system that tried to bury him was crumbling. The headlines hit like a shockwave. Prosecutor Robert Calloway resigns amid evidence tampering allegations. Judge Whitmore suspended indefinitely following corruption scandal. Internal investigation launched into false conviction of Jaden Carter. Jaden sat at Vanessa's desk, staring at the news reports flooding every screen. Social media was on fire. News anchors debated his case on live television. Protesters stood outside the courthouse, demanding justice not just for him, but for everyone the system had failed. They had won, but it didn't feel like victory. Elijah sat beside him, scrolling through his phone. Calloway didn't even make a statement before stepping down. He muttered. Dude ran like a coward. Vanessa leaned against the wall, arms crossed. Because he knows if he opens his mouth, he's done. The DA's office is trying to contain the damage, but it's too late. His career is over. Jaden should have felt relief. He should have been celebrating. Instead, his fingers tightened into fists. What about Reynolds? He asked, voice steady. A heavy silence fell over the room. Vanessa sighed, rubbing her temples. That's the problem. She turned the laptop toward him. He's gone. Jaden's stomach dropped. What do you mean, gone? Elijah frowned, leaning in. Vanessa clicked through news reports. There was nothing. No statement, no press release, no mention of Reynolds in any official documents. It was as if he had disappeared into thin air. Whitmore got suspended. Calloway resigned. But Reynolds? Vanessa exhaled sharply. There's no record of him stepping down. No mention of an internal investigation into him. The man just vanished. Jaden's jaw clenched. Reynolds had known this was coming. He ran, Vanessa nodded, or someone made sure he wouldn't be found. Jaden's pulse pounded. This wasn't over. Not even close. Elijah leaned back, shaking his head. I don't get it. The guy was a captain, a high-ranking officer. He can't just disappear. Jaden's voice was quiet but filled with certainty. He can if the people protecting him are bigger than we thought. The thought made the air feel thicker, heavier. Reynolds wasn't just some corrupt cop. He had powerful people backing him, people who had made sure he wouldn't face consequences. Elijah swallowed. So what do we do? Jaden exhaled slowly, his mind racing. A week had passed since the scandal broke, since headlines had screamed, "Prosecutor resigns in shame," since Judge Whitmore had been stripped of his position. The media had feasted on the story for days: corruption, police cover-ups, and the near destruction of a 14-year-old boy's future. Then, as expected, they moved on. Jaden Carter sat on his bed, the glow of his phone screen illuminating his tired face. He scrolled through endless news articles, watching how quickly the world forgot. They always forgot. For a moment, he had been at the center of something big. His case had sparked protests, debates, even a call for justice reform. People had flooded the streets demanding accountability. But now there were new stories to tell, new villains to expose, and the one villain Jaden had wanted to see behind bars? Captain Victor Reynolds had disappeared. There had been no official statements, no arrests, no hearings, nothing. Vanessa had warned him that Reynolds wouldn't go down so easily. Men like him don't get punished, she had said. They just disappear until it's safe to come back. Jaden didn't want to believe it. He had fought too hard, lost too much. And yet, it was as if Reynolds had simply erased himself from existence. Jaden let out a slow breath and shut off his phone. He needed to clear his head. The air in his room felt too thick, too heavy, like an invisible force was pressing down on him. Maybe it was just paranoia. Maybe he needed to move on, like everyone else. Then his phone buzzed. A single notification. Unknown number. Jaden frowned, unlocking the screen. His eyes narrowed as he read the message. We're watching you. A sharp chill ran down his spine. His body went still, muscles locking in place. His pulse thumped against his ribs. His first instinct was denial. Maybe it was a mistake, a prank, a random troll trying to get under his skin. But deep down, he knew. It wasn't random. Jaden sat up slowly, eyes darting around his darkened room. The blinds were shut, the door locked. But suddenly it didn't feel safe. His phone buzzed again. "You should have let it go." Jaden exhaled sharply, his grip tightening around the device. His heart pounded, a steady, angry rhythm. Reynolds. He wasn't in prison. He wasn't under investigation. He was still out there, still pulling strings, still watching. Jaden's mind spun. The message wasn't just a warning, it was a reminder. Reynolds wasn't running. He was waiting, waiting for the dust to settle, waiting for Jaden to slip up, waiting for the world to forget. Jaden forced himself to breathe. The fear clawing at his chest wasn't going to help him. He needed to think. His fingers moved across the keyboard, hesitating only briefly before he typed his response. "Come find me." He hit send, and then he waited, because this wasn't over. Not yet. Jaden stood on the cracked sidewalk, watching as a soft breeze stirred the detritus of a city that had started to move on from his story, from the scandal that had momentarily consumed its headlines. He knew better than anyone that a single victory, no matter how public or dramatic, did not truly dismantle the system responsible for his near downfall. Yes, he had escaped prison. Yes, he had forced resignations. And yes, he had exposed corruption. But the deeper architecture of injustice remained firmly in place, looming like a fortress carved from centuries of prejudice and power. The fact that Captain Reynolds had vanished rather than answer for his crimes told Jaden that the shadows still harbored those who believed themselves untouchable. He could picture Reynolds in some undisclosed office, biding his time, waiting for the heat to die down before re-emerging like a ghost. Jaden had once glimpsed the chilling certainty in Reynolds' eyes, a man who saw laws as pliable obstacles rather than moral anchors. People like that did not simply vanish. They adapted, they survived, and they thrived. Jaden had learned a cruel lesson about how deeply these forces shaped his reality. He had been arrested, dragged through a trial that declared him guilty the moment he set foot in the courtroom, all for daring to be a smart black kid in the wrong place at the wrong time. The system's gears had nearly crushed him, tried to rewrite his entire history to suit its narrative, to brand him as a savage in a hoodie who must be locked away. Even with the evidence he had brought to light, fake suspects, altered records, a judge who laughed at impartiality, he knew the system had not truly changed. Hollow promises of reform filled the air, and fleeting press conferences declared an internal review was underway. Yet beneath that surface, the same old structures thrived. If a boy like Jaden could be manipulated so easily, there were countless others whose stories never even made the papers. Knowing that, Jaden recognized he could not just walk away. An ember of determination burned inside him, fed by each indignity he had endured. He felt it intensify whenever he remembered how close he had come to spending years behind bars. He recalled the swirl of crowds outside the courthouse, some chanting his name, others demanding his imprisonment. In that chaos, he realized that if he did not use this spotlight to push for real change, then everything he went through would be for nothing. And so, a mere week after escaping a sham trial, he started planning his next move. He no longer wanted to simply survive. He wanted to ensure that the machine that nearly swallowed him could not do the same to others. This time, he wanted to uproot the rot. He was only 14, armed with limited resources and a small circle of allies: Elijah, a tech-savvy friend who had unearthed the truth, and Vanessa, the lawyer who had refused to let the powerful crush him. Together, they had accomplished more than anyone would have believed. Yet this fight was bigger than 3 determined individuals. Jaden would need more voices, more courage, and a movement that extended beyond social media outrage. Each day, he pored over laws with renewed intensity, searching for cracks in the structure. He read about civil rights heroes who had confronted even more brutal injustices in times when entire governments sanctioned oppression. He took notes, highlighted passages, plastered quotes on his bedroom walls to surround himself with reminders that no system of oppression was truly invincible. The city returned to routine. The roiling outrage settled into old currents of apathy, with many shrugging, believing they had done enough by noticing the scandal. That boy at the center, the one whose face dominated the news, was just another fleeting headline. Jaden, however, was still here, plotting not vengeance but lasting justice. He lay awake envisioning grassroots campaigns, alliances with reporters who refused to let truth be buried under spin. He imagined a place where a kid like him could walk without fear of being snatched by an officer who decided he fit the description. The question remained, how to sustain momentum once the scandal dulled in the public mind? Giving up was not an option. He thought of the children who might follow, brilliant and curious, doomed to become stereotypes if someone did not challenge the architecture of injustice. He also remembered the night he had fled from gunfire, the dark SUV that had pursued him, the raw terror of knowing the system was a ravenous beast with jaws ready to snap shut. If he quit, that beast would feed on others, never sated. No, he carried a responsibility. He might be free, but invisible chains still encircled him. He had to fight. Even if he stood alone, he would fight, because the alternative was to let darkness claim future generations. Elijah was with him, and Vanessa had promised to use every legal tool to protect them. Others might join too, awakened by the seeds of truth Jaden had sown. Reynolds might have faded into the shadows, but shadows could be lit. Whitmore was off the bench. Yet the bench was an institution, and institutions could be reformed or dismantled if pressed hard enough. Passing the half-faded graffiti that once demanded justice for Jaden, he understood this was a beginning, not a conclusion. It was easy to cheer a judge or prosecutor's fall, but the fortress of injustice stood tall, older than them all. Watching them fall proved how fragile the system could be when confronted with persistent truth. He smiled grimly, footsteps echoing on deserted streets. Yes, he had won a battle, but the war raged on. He felt it in his bones, that electric pulse fueling him with the conviction that he could never be done until the day no child endured what he endured. This was the genesis of something larger than a single person's fight, more than a headline or viral post. It was the forging of a new path, a promise that one day the ideals carved into courthouse pillars would mean more than empty words. He glanced up at a street lamp, recalling how he once stood beneath it, handcuffed, his future in question. Now he stood as an architect of change, free yet carrying a mission. No neat, happy ending awaited, only the promise of a revolution brewing within his heart. One day, he vowed, the world would see a justice system that truly served everyone. One day, the name Jaden Carter would not be a near tragedy, but a spark that ignited a movement. With every step, he reminded himself that even if the fight felt lonely, even if the system appeared immovable, he was prepared. Because nothing was more potent than a believer who refused to yield, who refused to let the next generation grow up in the same shadow. He lifted his collar against the wind and pressed on, determined to tear down the walls. This was only the opening salvo. The real battle was just beginning. He remembered the gavel strikes, the scorn in the eyes of officials who never gave him the benefit of the doubt. He recalled the hush that fell whenever he tried to speak up, the weight of a system that preferred obedience to justice. Yet he also remembered the spark he felt when evidence of corruption splashed across social media, when people from every corner of the city rallied to his side, refusing to be blind any longer. That spark was still alive, dancing in his chest, urging him to continue, to defy every limit they placed before him. He would learn the law, break it down piece by piece, until he knew exactly where to strike, exactly which flaw to expose. And he would gather people, families tired of living in fear, activists who believed every life mattered, teachers who refused to let their students be profiled by the color of their skin. One day the fortress of injustice would crumble beneath their collective will. He was certain of it, more certain than he had ever been of anything. This was his path now, his oath, and he would not be silent. He was Jaden Carter, and he was nobody's scapegoat. He was the architect of the fight to come. His revolution began now. If Jaden's fight for justice moved you, Don't let this story fade away. Like this video to show your support, subscribe to stay updated on more eye-opening stories, and share to spread awareness. Every click, every comment, and every share keeps the conversation alive. Justice isn't just a headline, it's a battle we must keep fighting. Let's make sure voices like Jaden's are heard, not silenced. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter in this fight. Your support matters. Be part of the change. Like, subscribe, share. The fight continues.